in which case we'll be able to get rolling here. We are about halfway through the third of the 5 essays in 1 Corinthians. There's this center section where Paul talks, it's all focused or presented in the context of food offered to idols, which may seem kind of odd or irrelevant to us today, but that's going to be part of the challenge, is to figure out how this does actually apply to us today. And what are the teachings there, and how does it come through? We'll hope that they get things rolling here momentarily, but let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for this day, and thank you for letting us come together as your children to study your word. We pray that you bless us with open hearts and minds, that we can hear and understand what it is that you're saying to us, that it finds a home in us and we take it to heart and grow from it. We know that this walk that you've given us is not an easy thing. It takes discipline and perseverance. Help us to understand the way that we should walk and to go after this wholeheartedly. We ask your blessings for those that have lost loved ones or other situations that are in need of comfort. We ask for those who are dealing with illnesses or surgical procedures and such that are in need of healing. We ask your blessing for strength and comfort and healing for all of these. Please guide us through this lesson and through every day of our lives and bring us safely home. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. And we're still not up. Okay, I hope you have your hard copies, because we are up to, let me get this right, the heading 3.4, Old Covenant and Idolatry. As I was saying, we've gone through these first parts where Paul introduces this whole question of food offered to idols. That seems hard to wrap our heads around today. You know, here you've got a major section of a major letter that is all set in the context of food offered to idols and how the Christians should react to that, what they should do. How do we apply this to today in our situations? Do we have idolatry around us? Yes? For example, James. Worship what? Oh, their car. James says some people worship their car. Okay. What, Robert? Oh. Where? Worship other people. Such as? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Okay, the worship men. Oh, don't do that. Robert. Robert says that there are many other religions that have idolatry in their practices and their creeds. Bill said a lot of people worship their recreational activities. How many people are crazy about football? This is a challenge. To kind of summarize, well, I don't know if I should say summarize, but to kind of get at the gist of what Paul's saying in all this, with food offered to idols, is the food doesn't matter. Everything, the earth is the Lord's and all that's in it. He quotes this in the section that we are going to do if we can get the projection going. Everything belongs to God, and if we partake with thankfulness, there's nothing wrong with that. Doesn't matter who said what about it. However, we do have to be concerned of what others see us doing and what they would interpret our actions to be. So, I'm not exactly sure what a concrete example of this would be, but there are things that we can do that are perfectly legitimate. There's nothing wrong with it. However, if someone says, come to my house and eat this, and this is something that we're celebrating a feast day or something or other to, I don't know, St. Bartholomew, whatever, and that this is special because of that, and if we partake of that as though we are recognizing that celebration and participating in it, that becomes a problem because that endorses. Our action would be seen as an endorsement of this practice that is not legitimate. So one of the main things Paul's driving here is, although you are free to do a lot of things, not everything, but a lot of things, we still have to be concerned about how others see that and perceive it. Because if our actions are interpreted by them as endorsement of false worship, that's a problem. That encourages them to continue in that, as opposed to helping them to see clearly. Even without the projection, let's go on here. Starting at chapter 10, verse 1, this next section reads, "For I did not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall." And then, as sort of seemingly sort of an aside. It doesn't quite fit in with the flow there. Is verse 13, no temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not let you be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, that you will be able to endure it. So he starts out, listen, I don't want you to be ignorant. I don't want you to be unaware. Listen, pay attention to these things. Israel went through the Red Sea. They were baptized in the sea and the cloud. As it were, they were baptized. They were initiated. That's how Israel came out, and their journey to the promised land began. They all ate of the same food. They ate of the manna in the wilderness. We partake of the same food together. But a big point here that Paul's making is starting is not the end. They started out on the journey, but almost all of them fell in the wilderness. The point is to finish, not just to begin. We start a journey with a purpose, with a goal. And the point is to continue on, keep going, get to the end, get to the promised land. The examples that are given here, don't be idolaters. The people sat down, well, you know the story, you know the account of what happened at Mount Sinai. How Moses was up on the mountain and he'd been a while, and the people were saying, we don't know what happened to him. Make us a god, to lead us out of here. And Aaron said, all right, everybody who's got your gold earrings, give them to me. And he fashioned the golden calf from it. And then they had their feast. And then they got up to revelry. This was not a good idea. They got kind of tired of waiting. They were impatient. Do you ever get tired of waiting for things to resolve? When are these problems going to end? When am I going to see the light at the end of the tunnel? That was in Exodus 32. The next one, nor let us act immorally as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. This is referencing Numbers 25, I believe. They were in the wilderness. Me speak up. Does that matter? Okay. They were in the wilderness, and they were close to the Moabites, and they started interacting with the Moabites. And more than interacting, intercourse with the Moabites. And there apparently was a plague. God was displeased, and there was a plague. And then, I forget the man's name, but he brought this woman in the middle of the camp, right in front of everybody, while the whole congregation was in front of the tent of meeting, weeping because of this plague. This guy walks in with a woman just as brazen as could be. Aaron's grandson took a spear and drove it right through both of them, and that was part of the end. They were also told, the leaders were told, go and kill those who have been doing this, which they did, and the plague was stopped. Sorry if I mixed up the details a little bit, but you can read it. The next section, nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did and were destroyed by the serpents. This is the case where in Numbers 21, they were going to move and they were going to go around Edom rather than going directly to the promised land, to Canaan. They were going to go around Edom, take the long path, because Edom didn't want to let them go through. And again, people were impatient. You're just taking us out here to die in the wilderness. And there was a lot of grumbling going on. God sent the fiery serpents among them, bit them, and lots of people died. This is what is referenced in John 3:14-15. For as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Where this may not make a lot of sense to us if we try to put a physical connection to it, but he was told, make a bronze serpent. They put it on a pole. Whoever came and looked at it, if they had been bitten, they would live. And this is the very reference to Jesus and his crucifixion. And then, still nothing. Nor grumbling as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. In Numbers in 16 and 17, there was Korah's rebellion. He was of the tribe of Levi, and he and 250 of the elders got together and said, enough of this. We're good too. The whole congregation is holy. Why do Moses and Aaron have this special place? We should be just as good as they are. Well, that wasn't the way God set it up. And he said, all right, have these 250 men take their fire pans, put incense on them, and come before me tomorrow. And we'll see. God will select the one or ones that are to be listened to. Along with this, there was Dathan and Abiram, who were descendants of Reuben. They were also in this rebellion. Moses sent to them, said, come, and they said, we're not even coming. Forget you. So, the next day came, and these 250 brought their fire pans with incense, and fire came out from the Lord and burned them all up. All that was left was the bronze fire pans. God said, those were holy. Take those and hammer them into sheeting to cover the altar as a reminder to the people of Israel. So they would see this on the altar and remember. As far as Dathan and Abiram, he went there and told all the people, get away from them. Because if you don't, you're going to be caught up in their destruction. So here were these two with their families and all their stuff, and they're standing there like, what are you going to do to us? Moses said, if what I'm doing comes from the Lord, these people are not going to die like normal people, but the earth is going to open up and swallow them. And it did. Of course, after all this, the people were kind of frantic of, what do we do? Everybody's dying. Are we going to make it? Well, do what you're supposed to do. Things had been set out for them, and all they needed to do was follow and be faithful. These things happened to them as an example and were written for our instruction. So these attitudes that they had are big things that we are likely to fall into, we need to be aware of, to check ourselves and put an end to it if it's springing up in us. The pride, the impatience, the grumbling, all of these things. Any comments? James? Part of what James said, I can't say it all, but was to fill in a little bit that of those that were in Israel, for those that were in the wilderness, only those that were 20 years old and younger, except for Joshua and Caleb, actually got to enter the promised land. The others were destroyed in the wilderness in this 40 years of wandering about. And he reiterated that we do need to watch ourselves, be careful, take heed to these things. Robert. Robert pointed out that each one of these things that people were doing, that the children of Israel were doing in the wilderness, was looking backward to the lives they'd had before in Egypt. And that we are in the same danger of looking backward to the times before we were redeemed and wanting that again, or wanting to mix it in with what we have now, and they're not compatible. Yes.
Verse 6, Paul warns them not to desire evil as the children of Israel did. Then he goes over in verse 10 or 13 and says, no temptation has overtaken you. So he's basically saying, he gave them the examples, and he said, don't desire those kinds of evils, because there are when you're tempted, you have a means of escape. So he's tying 13 back to 6.
Mm-hmm. I remember Larry doing a sermon on 1 Corinthians 10:13 with the idea that people were saying that God tempts us. Do you remember that? It wasn't that long ago. And personally, I never took it that way. Apparently, some people have taken it that way. Consider my servant Job. with Job being the classic example, God did not tempt Job. He allowed him to be tested. And he put limits on the temptations and testing such that he would be able to get through it. So count it all joy, my brethren. That's a hard one. I mean, when you're in the middle of something, count it all joy. In the one sense, it seems selfish to think, oh, I'm going to be better for this, especially if it's dealing with like a family illness or something like that. But we do come through things. If we hold faithful, we do come through stronger. If we're lucky, we'll get through the next two sections. Starting then at verse 14. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. You judge what I say. Is not the cup of blessing which we bless a sharing in the blood of Christ? Is not the bread which we break a sharing in the body of Christ? Since there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Look at the nation Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices sharers in the altar? What do I mean then? That a thing sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, but I say that things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons, not to God. And I do not want you to become sharers in demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we strong? We are not stronger than he, are we? The argument that he presents here has a strong parallel to the ones that he presented earlier with regard to sexual immorality and the joining to prostitutes, where he cited the two become one flesh. To engage in certain things is to do damage to yourself. Prostitution and Christianity are not compatible. The table of demons and the table of the Lord are not compatible. We can't have both. We are offered the choice. We make the choice. We follow that choice. But we can't do both. Paul's already he talks a lot about food here. But he's made it clear that the food itself doesn't matter. All the food comes from God. And whatever comes from him is acceptable. However, that same food could be considered profane under certain circumstances, or something that we should not partake of under certain circumstances. What's the difference? Those circumstances create the difference. And our attitude in this, if we don't have idol food in general, but you might go with someone to some sort of service that they have. And if they see you participating as though endorsing it, that's a problem. Robert points an example from his father, usually good advice, is that if you're someplace with friends, associates, whatever, and they're drinking, even if you're not, others might see you there and mistake it. This is really tricky. How much do you say, well, just, I won't go there? Do we cloister ourselves away from the world? Paul said, if you're going to avoid this stuff, you have to leave the world. Well, we don't have that option. So we cannot completely stay away from all these things. But we do have to be extremely careful in how we conduct ourselves and who is watching while watching us do what we do and how they might understand it. Kurt.
And in regard to what Robert said, we shouldn't be, just like Jesus even with the Pharisees, or even with the tax collectors, he was criticizing that. We even said it, I think it was Satan, the righteous don't eat gossip, the sick do. And for the one that Robert mentioned, is our purpose growing up too, be careful where you are in the influence. And hopefully we as Christians, if we saw a brother or sister sitting in a bar with somebody, we immediately would say, I can't believe you're there, I can't believe are they drinking? I hope they would say, I think they're there to be the influence. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
We wouldn't pass judgment without knowing the facts. And because we do need to go where they are. We don't need to participate in what they do, but we need to go where they are.
Last week, after the class, Ken Lowry told me an example of where he grew up in Tennessee, that they had dry counties and such, and that there was a big deal about if anyone was seen any place that served alcohol. It doesn't matter if you're actually partaking or what you're doing, just being seen there, people would talk. And as Kurt just said, we've got to be careful about the assumptions we jump to. We cannot assume that just because somebody is in a certain place that they're doing something wrong. After all, the people that we need to reach are in those places. That doesn't mean that you go running into, well, we have to be careful. We have to consider just how strong are we as individuals and what are we going to be tempted by and what can we hold true. I mean, can we stand this and not be affected by it? James. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time understanding you.
Yeah, I said, you talk about our worship, right? And I was wondering, can we make, for instance, our singing with you divine and you take up, that, for instance, a child later wants to take of that you divine and say, no, this is safe. See, once we do, it's just regular juice. So, but if we have the attitude that it's still sacred and the kid can't take it, I wonder if that making that wine an idol.
It's an interesting thing. If I understood correctly, James is saying if we have communion and then there's the leftover juice and somebody, a child wants to drink it, or someone who's not been baptized, is that wrong? Would we be treating that as though, as some Christians do, they say the blessing over it and now it's special? the juice itself is now special, sacred. Do we do that? Or would the child or the person who drank that think it was, and that they're going to derive some special benefit from this? Life is just full of pitfalls, isn't it? Dennis.
Paul gets a little more specific on this and a little clearer in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, where he talks about the church not having any sort of harmony or concord with the world or with the evil things of the world. That's one of the problems that we're always going to run into. Yes, we want to address the people who are lost, and as Paul, we want to be all things to all people so that we can gain them to Christ. But at the same time, Paul's also telling us we need to be separate. In other words, if we are with people of, say, of a denominational religion or something along those lines, then there needs to be an acknowledgement that we are separate. We can't pretend to approve of the things that are going on in either the world or in other religions just for the sake of gaining people to Christ. I think that's kind of what Paul's trying to say here. And you're right, it's a very fine line that we have to walk.
Dennis pointed to 2 Corinthians where Paul speaks of this some more. And we do need to interact with the world, and we do have to be separate from the world. And this is not the easiest thing to do. We have about 5 or 7 minutes, so let's do this third section here. Starting at verse 23. Paul kind of wraps this up again in the context of food offered to idols. All things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. Now, we've heard this before. He's said this before. The all things are lawful was apparently something that people were taking to an extreme. And so he's putting a context in this. You may have this freedom, but it's not necessarily a good thing to exercise it. Certainly not in all situations. Going on. Eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. That thing, the earth is the Lord's, appears twice. In Exodus 9:29, where Moses was before Pharaoh, and he told him the earth is the Lord's. And again, in fullness, in Psalm 24, verse 1, is what is clearly quoted here. The earth is the Lord's and all it contains. It all was made by and comes from him. And what people do and how they wave their hands over it between that and us eating it really doesn't make a difference. It is from him. If one of the unbelievers invites you and you want to go, eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake, I mean not your own conscience, but the others, do not eat it. For why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I slandered concerning that for which I give thanks? Whether then you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to Jews or to Greeks, or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of the many, so that they may be saved. Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. So he comes back here saying, if it's going to set a bad example for somebody else, if they're going to misinterpret it, if they attach a significance to it that doesn't mean a thing to you, but it is important to them, for their sake, don't do it. This is love. You have to think about what you're doing, think about the situation, think about the person that you're with or who's watching, how they're going to perceive it, what significance they're going to attach to it, how it's going to affect them, how they're going to interpret your example and act accordingly. And that is no small bill. What is our big thing in this country? I'm free. Jason.
I mean, it's just another example of a Christian where our focus is outward and not on ourselves. And to your point, in this country, selfishness reigns king. It's about us because of our freedom. But as Christians, it's never about us. It's about the person beside me, whether they're a brother or sister in Christ or not. And that's exactly what Paul is trying to emphasize. You know, I need to take whoever's with me into account when I make that decision, whether I eat that meat or not.
Did you all hear? Good. I've been racking my brain the last couple of days trying to come up with something that would be a clear example of this today. Since, so far as I know, nobody's going to offer me food that's been offered to idols. But what sorts of things, I don't know that we can answer this, but it's certainly something to think about. What do we face in our lives today that is an analog, a parallel to what Paul's emphasizing here? This was a big deal in the first century. There were temples to idols everywhere. There were probably about a dozen pagan temples in Corinth, all centered around, plus the one up on the hill for Aphrodite. But right there in the center of the city, there were a bunch of these temples, and the meat market was right next to it. What in our lives parallels this?
I know we're talking about pagan worship and stuff, but today we do have, and we've got neighbors in my neighborhood who are Jewish, and you sit down and eat a meal with them, and it's not been blessed, so it's kosher. You know, they will call it out and tell you, you have to make sure if you bring food to their house that it's kosher, right? And we don't think about that. Like when you go to the store and you think, well, I'm buying kosher salt, you don't think about that. Because as a Christian, it doesn't impact me, but it does my neighbor. Right? So that's the one time that I've been able to relate what you're talking about here with Paul and food. That's the only time in my life I've been able to relate that. And I've been asked, is this kosher food?
Jason brings up the point of having some Jewish neighbors, and if you bring food to their house, they're going to ask, is this kosher? Our time has run out. Next week we'll start on the fourth essay, which is a big one. Thanks for your participation.